I was 23 years old in March 1937, working as a driver for Bumpy Johnson's organization in Harlem, and I've been part of his crew for about 18 months, long enough to understand how things worked, but not long enough to have seen real violence up close, the kind of violence that changes you permanently and makes you understand that this life isn't a game or an adventure, but something deadly serious that can end in seconds. My job was simple. I drove cars for pickups and deliveries, transported money and occasionally people, waited in vehicles while business got conducted, and kept my mouth shut about everything I saw, which was the most important part of being a driver in Bumpy Johnson's organization. You could see everything, but you couldn't talk about anything, or you'd end up in the East River wearing concrete shoes. On March 22, 1937, I was sitting in my apartment around 3 in the afternoon, my day off, reading the newspaper and thinking about going to see a movie later, when someone started pounding on my door hard enough to shake the frame, and I opened it to find Illinois Gordon standing there, looking more intense than I'd ever seen him. And Illinois was Bumpy's right-hand man, his enforcer and closest confidant, so when Illinois showed up at your door unannounced, it meant something serious was happening. "Get dressed, bring your gun, we need you now," Illinois said without preamble, already turning to leave, assuming I'd follow. And I did follow, because you didn't question Illinois Gordon when he showed up with orders. You just did what he said and hoped it wouldn't get you killed. I threw on clothes, grabbed my .38 revolver from the drawer beside my bed, and ran down 4 flights of stairs to where Illinois was waiting in a black Chevrolet with the engine running. And as soon as I got in, he handed me keys and said, "You're driving. I need to focus on what we're about to do." And I slid behind the wheel without asking questions, because asking questions was a good way to get told to mind your business or worse. Illinois directed me to the Red Rooster Club, where Bumpy kept his main office, and when we pulled up, I saw activity that made my stomach drop. Men loading Thompson submachine guns into cars, checking pistols, moving with the kind of focused intensity that meant violence was imminent. And I realized whatever was happening wasn't business as usual. This was war preparation. Willie Jackson saw me and walked over. "You know how to drive fast?" he asked, and I nodded because I was actually a good driver, had grown up driving my father's delivery truck through Manhattan traffic, knew how to handle a vehicle in tight situations. And Willie said, "Good, because you're driving one of the crews to Little Italy, and we might need to leave quick." And hearing Little Italy made my blood go cold, because going into Italian mob territory meant crossing lines that usually got people killed. Inside the Red Rooster, Bumpy was briefing his crew, 7 men total, including me as driver, and I heard for the first time what had happened. That Thomas Johnson, Bumpy's younger brother who I'd met a few times, a nice, quiet guy who worked as an accountant and had nothing to do with criminal operations, had been kidnapped off 131st Street by 4 Italian men, thrown into a black Packard, and taken to a warehouse in Little Italy. Bumpy's face was completely calm as he explained this, but I'd learned to read him well enough to see the rage underneath, the cold, controlled fury that was more dangerous than any shouting or threats. And he said simply, "They took my brother to create leverage, so we're going to take him back and show them what happens when you touch my family." And the way he said it made clear this wasn't going to be a negotiation or a hostage exchange. This was going to be a massacre. The plan was explained quickly and efficiently. 3 cars would drive to Little Italy, park 2 blocks from the warehouse where contacts had confirmed Thomas was being held, and then 3 teams of 2 men each would hit 3 different entrances simultaneously at exactly 4:26, overwhelming the guards through speed and coordination and superior firepower. My job was to drive Bumpy and Illinois to the location, wait with the engine running, and be ready to get them out the moment they emerged with Thomas, no matter what condition anyone was in. No hesitation, no questions, just drive. We left the Red Rooster at 4 o'clock, 3 cars and a convoy heading south through Manhattan, and I was driving the lead car with Bumpy in the passenger seat and Illinois in the back, both of them checking their Thompson submachine guns, loading magazines, preparing for violence with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this many times before. The drive took about 15 minutes. Traffic was light for that time of day,
and nobody spoke during the entire trip, just the sound of the engine and occasionally the metallic click of weapons being readied, and I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel, even though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. We parked 2 blocks from the warehouse on Mulberry Street, exactly where Bumpy had specified, positioning the car facing north for a quick exit, and I watched in my mirrors as the other 2 cars parked nearby, saw Willie and Raymond getting out of one vehicle, saw the other 2 crew members emerging from the 3rd car, everyone moving with purpose toward the warehouse from different directions. Bumpy checked his watch, turned to look at me, and said, "Keep the engine running, watch all directions. If you see police or Italian reinforcements, lay on the horn 3 times. If we're not back in 5 minutes, leave without us and tell Jerome to contact our lawyer." And then he and Illinois got out and walked toward the warehouse, and I was alone in that car in the middle of Little Italy with a running engine and instructions to either rescue them or abandon them, depending on how the next 5 minutes went. I sat there watching the street in all directions, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, and I heard my watch ticking, counting seconds that felt like hours, 4:25, 4:26, and then I heard it, gunfire, lots of gunfire, the distinctive rapid sound of Thompson submachine guns, maybe 3 or 4 of them firing simultaneously, and the sound echoed off the buildings in that narrow street, and people on the sidewalks started running, ducking into doorways, trying to get away from whatever violence was happening inside that warehouse. The gunfire lasted maybe 60 seconds, maybe less. It was hard to tell because time does strange things when you're sitting in a getaway car, listening to people die. And then silence, complete silence, that somehow was worse than the gunfire, because silence meant it was over, and I didn't know if over meant success or disaster, didn't know if Bumpy and Thomas were alive or dead, didn't know if I was about to drive away alone or with a car full of wounded men. At 4:28, exactly 2 minutes after they'd entered, I saw the warehouse door open and Bumpy emerged first, walking calmly, not running, with Thomas beside him, and then Illinois and the other crew members came out from different exits, all of them moving quickly but not panicking, all of them still carrying their weapons, and I realized they'd done it. They'd actually pulled off a rescue in the middle of Italian mob territory in daylight, and somehow they were all walking out alive. Bumpy and Illinois put Thomas in the back seat. Both of them got in, and Bumpy said simply, "Drive, normal speed, don't attract attention." And I pulled away from the curb and headed north, following the planned escape route we'd discussed, and I could see in the rearview mirror that Thomas was shaking. His clothes had blood on them, though he didn't appear injured, and his eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that people get when they've experienced trauma.
We drove in silence for about 10 blocks before Bumpy finally spoke, asking Thomas if he was hurt, and Thomas said no, he wasn't hurt, the blood wasn't his, and Bumpy nodded and told me to take them to Doc Miller's place in Harlem, the doctor who treated crew members without asking questions or filing reports with authorities. The other 2 cars followed us at a distance, maintaining separation, so if one got pulled over, the others could escape. Basic security protocol that I'd learned during my time with the organization. And we made it back to Harlem without incident. No police pursuit, no Italian mob cars following us, just a clean escape that seemed almost too easy considering what had just happened. At Doc Miller's office, I helped Thomas inside, while Bumpy and Illinois went to dispose of the weapons, and Thomas grabbed my arm and said, "They killed all of them, everyone in that warehouse. I watched Bumpy shoot a man who had a gun to my head. He didn't hesitate, didn't negotiate, just killed him. And the violence was—" and he trailed off because he couldn't find words to describe what he'd witnessed. But I understood, because I'd heard that gunfire, had counted the shots, had done the math in my head about how many men could have died in 60 seconds of sustained Thompson fire in a confined space. Later that evening, I was back at the Red Rooster, and the crew was there cleaning weapons and discussing what had happened, and I learned the full details for the first time. Learned that 7 Italian mob soldiers had been guarding Thomas, learned that Bumpy and his crew had killed all 7 without losing a single man, learned that they'd left a calling card on one of the bodies, a white card that said, "Touch my family again, see what happens," signed by Bumpy Johnson. And hearing that made me understand something important about how Bumpy operated. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a message, a communication through violence that was meant to prevent future violence by proving absolutely that certain lines could not be crossed without fatal consequences. Over the following days, I heard stories from people who'd been near the warehouse, heard that neighbors had called police, but nobody wanted to be a witness, heard that Lucky Luciano himself had gone to look at the bodies and see the calling card, heard that the Italian mob was trying to decide whether to retaliate or negotiate, and there was tension in Harlem because everyone expected war, expected car bombs and drive-by shootings, and all the violence that usually follows when you kill 7 made men from a powerful crime family. But the war never came. Instead, at 6:30 that evening, Bumpy received a phone call, and I was in the office when it happened, heard Bumpy's side of the conversation, heard him talking to Luciano himself, and from what I could hear, Luciano was apologizing, actually apologizing for kidnapping Thomas and proposing a meeting to establish peace. And when Bumpy hung up, he looked at Illinois and said, "Luciano wants to meet tomorrow at Grand Central, just him and me, to establish boundaries." And Illinois asked if it was a trap, and Bumpy said, "Probably not. Killing 7 of his men in his own territory convinced me I'm too dangerous to fight, so now he wants peace, because peace is cheaper than war." And I realized I'd just witnessed something extraordinary. I'd helped execute a military operation so violent and so successful that it had forced one of the most powerful mobsters in America to sue for peace rather than seek revenge. The next day, I drove Bumpy to Grand Central Terminal for his meeting with Luciano, dropped him off at 1 p.m., and waited in the car for 45 minutes, wondering if he'd walk out or if this whole thing was an elaborate setup to kill Bumpy in a public place where there were too many witnesses for a shootout. But at 1:17, Bumpy emerged from the terminal alone, got in the car, and said, "Take me back to Harlem. It's done." Luciano agreed to leave Harlem alone completely. No more expansion attempts, no more pressure on our operations, and in exchange, we stay out of Little Italy. And I drove him back, processing what this meant, that one afternoon of violence had accomplished what years of negotiation probably couldn't have, had established clear boundaries that would prevent future conflict, had proven that Bumpy Johnson's brother had been kidnapped, and within 2 hours, Bumpy had found him, rescued him, killed everyone guarding him, and forced Lucky Luciano to apologize and establish peace. And that truth was impressive enough without any exaggeration. I worked for Bumpy for another 8 years after that day, drove him to meetings and pickups and various business operations, and I never saw violence like that again. The rescue on Mulberry Street remained the most intense thing I was ever part of, and I think that's because the message had been sent so clearly and so violently that nobody wanted to test whether Bumpy would do it again. Thomas Johnson moved out of Harlem about a year later, got a job in Philadelphia as an accountant, put as much distance as he could between himself and his brother's criminal world, but he stayed in contact with Bumpy. They talked on the phone regularly, had dinner together when Thomas came back to New York, maintained their relationship despite what had happened, or maybe because of what had happened, because Thomas understood that his brother had killed 7 men without hesitation to save his life, had risked everything, including war with the Italian mob, to rescue him. And that kind of loyalty transcends normal family bonds and becomes something deeper. In 1945, Lucky Luciano was arrested and eventually deported to Italy, and the boundaries he'd established with Bumpy held even after he was gone. The Italian families continued to respect Harlem as Bumpy's territory, continued to avoid any operations that might provoke him, because the lesson of March 22, 1937 had become part of organized crime folklore, a cautionary tale about what happens when you cross certain lines with certain men, and nobody wanted to be the one to learn that lesson again firsthand. I left Bumpy's organization in 1945, got a legitimate job driving trucks, got married,
had kids, built a normal life far away from the violence and danger I'd been part of for 8 years. But I never forgot that afternoon in March 1937. Never forgot sitting in that car, listening to 60 seconds of gunfire, and knowing that 7 men were dying inside that warehouse. Never forgot driving Bumpy and Thomas back to Harlem with blood on Thomas's clothes and silence in the car, and the knowledge that I just participated in something that would echo through the criminal underworld for decades.
When Bumpy died in 1968 at age 62, I went to his funeral in Harlem, stood in the back of the church with hundreds of other people who'd known him or worked with him or been protected by him, and I thought about that day in 1937, thought about how Bumpy had responded to his brother's kidnapping, not with negotiation or caution, but with overwhelming violence that ended the threat permanently. And I realized that was the key to understanding who Bumpy Johnson really was. He wasn't cruel or sadistic. He didn't enjoy violence for its own sake, but he was absolutely willing to use violence decisively and completely when someone crossed the line of threatening his family. And that willingness, that certainty, that total commitment to protecting what mattered most to him was what made him legendary. Thomas Johnson died in 1989, lived to age 78, had a successful career as an accountant, raised a family, never had any involvement with criminal activity after that day he was rescued from the warehouse. And at his funeral, his children spoke about how their Uncle Bumpy had saved their father's life, how they existed because of what Bumpy did on March 22, 1937. And I sat there listening and thinking about the 7 men who died that day, thinking about how their deaths enabled Thomas to live and have children and grandchildren, thinking about the strange calculus of violence where 7 deaths somehow lead to dozens of lives that wouldn't otherwise exist. I'm 94 years old now, one of the last people still alive who was there that day, who participated in the planning and execution of the rescue, who drove the getaway car and listened to the gunfire and brought Bumpy and Thomas back to Harlem safely. And sometimes I wonder if I should feel guilty about my role in 7 deaths, but I can't quite manage that guilt because those 7 men were guarding a kidnap victim, were actively participating in a crime that could have ended with Thomas's death, and Bumpy's response, while extreme and violent and probably excessive by most standards, was also understandable given what they'd taken from him. The lesson I took from that day wasn't about the morality of violence or the ethics of revenge. It was simpler and more practical than that. It was about the importance of understanding boundaries, about knowing which lines you can cross and which lines will get you killed, about recognizing that some people have absolute limits beyond which there's no negotiation or compromise or mercy, just consequences delivered quickly and completely. Lucky Luciano learned that lesson in the most expensive way possible, losing 7 soldiers and being forced to apologize and establish peace from a position of weakness. But at least he learned it and survived. At least he recognized the reality of the situation and adjusted his strategy accordingly. And that pragmatic acceptance of reality probably saved dozens or hundreds of lives that would have been lost in the war that didn't happen because Luciano chose negotiation over retaliation. The 7 guards who died in that warehouse never got the chance to learn the lesson. They were following orders from their boss, protecting a high-value hostage, probably felt confident and safe because they were in Italian territory, surrounded by Italian support. And then suddenly, they weren't safe at all. Suddenly, Bumpy Johnson was kicking down doors with Thompson submachine guns, and 60 seconds later, they were all dead. No warning, no chance to surrender, just violence delivered so quickly and efficiently that resistance was impossible. I've thought about those 7 men over the decades, wondered if they had families, if their children grew up without fathers because Lucky Luciano made a bad decision, if their widows struggled financially or remarried or managed somehow to build lives after their husbands died in a warehouse in Little Italy. And I know Bumpy thought about them too, because he asked Luciano for their names and addresses and sent money to their families, not as an apology or an admission of guilt, but as a practical measure to prevent future retaliation, to remove any motivation for their children to seek revenge when they grew older. And that cold, pragmatic generosity was very typical of how Bumpy operated.
He would kill you without hesitation if you threatened his family, but he'd also make sure your family didn't suffer unnecessarily for your mistakes, would separate the guilty from the innocent, and treat each accordingly. The black Packard that was used in the kidnapping was found abandoned 3 days later in Brooklyn, completely stripped and burned, nothing left that could be traced back to Lucky Luciano's organization. And the warehouse on Mulberry Street where the rescue happened was sold within a month to new owners who had no connection to organized crime, the Italian mob apparently wanting to distance themselves from the location where they'd suffered such a significant defeat. And both of those facts tell you something about how seriously the mob took what had happened. They weren't just moving on from a tactical loss, they were erasing evidence and memories, trying to forget that Bumpy Johnson had invaded their territory in impunity and killed their soldiers without consequences. The Thompson submachine guns we used in the rescue were dropped in the East River by Illinois Gordon and Willie Jackson, weighted down with chains so they'd never be found. And the getaway cars we drove were stolen vehicles that had been repainted and had fake license plates, untraceable back to anyone in Bumpy's organization. All the usual precautions that professional criminals take to avoid leaving evidence that could be used in prosecutions. Though in this case, I don't think anyone was particularly worried about prosecution, because the Italian mob wasn't going to cooperate with police investigations that would expose their own criminal activities, and no witnesses were coming forward, because testifying against Bumpy Johnson in Harlem was a good way to have a short, unhappy life. The NYPD investigated the warehouse shooting. Detectives came to Harlem asking questions about Bumpy's whereabouts on March 22nd, and everyone they talked to provided alibis. Bumpy had been at the Red Rooster all afternoon playing cards with witnesses. Illinois had been visiting his mother in Brooklyn. Willie and Raymond had been at a boxing match with dozens of people who saw them there, all carefully constructed alibis that made it impossible to prove anything, even though everyone knew the truth. And eventually the investigation went nowhere, and the case went cold, and 7 unsolved murders got added to New York statistics, and life went on. I learned something important about power that day. Learned that power isn't just about money or connections or official authority. It's about the willingness to act decisively when circumstances require action. It's about understanding when negotiation is appropriate and when violence is necessary. It's about having absolute clarity about your priorities and defending them without hesitation or compromise. And Bumpy Johnson had all of that. Had the kind of power that comes from being completely certain about what matters and completely willing to kill or die to protect it. And that certainty made him more dangerous than men with bigger organizations or more resources, because those men would calculate and hesitate and try to find solutions that didn't cost them too much, while Bumpy would simply act quickly and violently and effectively and deal with the consequences later. The calling card that Willie Jackson left on the guard leader's chest became legendary in organized crime circles. I heard stories about it for years afterward. Heard that Lucky Luciano kept it framed in his office as a reminder. Heard that other mob bosses asked to see it because they couldn't believe someone would be bold enough to sign a mass murder with their own name. Heard that it became a teaching tool used by older criminals to educate younger ones about the importance of respecting boundaries, about knowing which lines you can cross and which lines will get you killed, about recognizing that some people have absolute limits beyond which there's no negotiation or compromise or mercy, just consequences delivered quickly and completely. If this story taught you something about the importance of defending your boundaries absolutely, about how sometimes overwhelming violence prevents future violence by establishing clear consequences for crossing certain lines, then subscribe to hear more true stories about people who understood power and used it decisively, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts about whether Bumpy's response was justified or excessive, whether killing 7 men to rescue 1 brother was proportional, or whether it was overkill. And remember that however you answer that question, Lucky Luciano answered it by apologizing and establishing peace, which tells you everything you need to know about how the people actually involved in the situation evaluated the morality and necessity of what happened that day on Mulberry Street in March 1937.